In this lesson, we will begin looking at issues related to data management. In previous lessons, we began to be exposed to data with respect to issues such as scale of measurement. With data management, we will begin looking at the process for transferring data and importing it into a software package that will allow us to begin conducting our analyses. So, to begin our discussion, we must look at the question, what is data management? For our purposes, data management is simply used or refers to a workflow process that involves issues such as importing, cleaning, and recoding of data in order to conduct analyses. And this process will also involve the use of code books, which we have been exposed to briefly in previous lessons, and the assignment of variable labels and value labels once the data have been imported into SPSS. Now, keep in mind that the workflow can be applied to a situation in which any analysis program or analysis software is used, whether it's a specific statistical package such as SPSS, or if it is a generic program such as Excel. When we begin talking about data management, one thing that will impact the specific workflow that we follow is our data source. Now, in this particular context, we're not concerned about whether the data was derived from a survey or whether the data was derived from simply a collection of vital statistics or something like that. Essentially, what we're saying is, in what format is the data when we receive it? And basically, we have two possible options. We have data that is essentially in hard copy format, which we will in turn have to enter manually into our software, or we may acquire data that is already in an electronic format, in which case, again, we will have to go through an import process, but our workflow will be different. And in a later video, we will look at the workflows or example workflows that can be associated with each of these types of data sources. Now, if we talk a little more closely about manual data entry, generally speaking, manual data entry is going to be reserved for small studies or situations where you're given a class exercise that has a small number of cases. With large studies, if a manual data entry format is going to be used, then one issue that will typically come up is the need for or the use of multiple individuals who are working as data processors. In other words, if we are simply going to go and collect data from patient files that are currently in a hard copy format, then we will have to pull the files, scan the files for the information that we are looking for our study, and then manually key it into our software. The main issue in terms of complications associated with a manual data entry is the fact that it is prone to input error. And that could be simply a typo in terms of entering a value that essentially is a non-existent value or a value that is outside the range of possibilities, or it could simply mean that we have simply mistyped a number. If we have, for example, a pain scale and the patient was asked to rate their pain level on a range of 1 to 10, or if we use the smiley face index and we assign values of 1 to 10, and we come across a data value that has been entered, and it happened to be a value of 35, or then that would indicate that somehow we simply made a mistake. We inadvertently hit an extra key, but it caused a value that simply cannot exist based on the scale that we were using. Likewise, we could simply have a situation where we inadvertently entered 8 instead of 5 because 8 is above 5 on the keyboard, and we simply inadvertently hit the wrong number. In either situation, that will have an impact on our results, particularly if we have those values that are outside the range of possibilities, because then we start to really get some skewness in our findings. So again, manual data entry typically reserved for smaller scale situations, but even in smaller scale situations, we do have to be aware of the fact that we can have potential errors with our input. Now, for our second type of situation, where we have retrieved data electronically. Now, this could be a situation where we have located information through a database online. This could be a situation where we maybe are accessing those same patient files as discussed previously, but now we have all the patient files electronically, and we have a system set up where we can, or either personally we can access, or we can submit a request to have selected pieces of information downloaded into an electronic file. That file then is simply imported into our software of choice. Now, some of the most common types of files when you're talking about receiving data that's already in an electronic format are going to be very program-specific files. For example, you may be able to obtain a copy of the data that's already formatted for SPSS, or you may be able to get a copy that's already formatted for SAS, which is another statistical software, or R, which is again another type of software. So these would be very program specific formats. Now, the downside to program specific formats is if you are working collaboratively with other colleagues, you may be using one software and your colleague may have access to another software. And while programs have evolved and are better able to handle importing files that are already specified for other programs, generally speaking, you are going to be limited if you have program-specific formats. So again, if you're the sole researcher, you know you're using SPSS and you have the ability to get the data in an SPSS format, that's great. If you're going to be working as a team, then collecting that data or retrieving that data already in a predefined format may not be the most attractive way to get your initial set of data. The other common format is going to be in an Excel format. Again, Excel format, while it may sound like how is that different for program specific, it is slightly different in the fact simply that Excel is a generic spreadsheet. It's not a statistical package. And so what essentially happens then is most of your statistical packages actually have the ability to read Excel formats. Now, that does not work necessarily the other way around. So for example, if you have an SPSS data file, that may not open up into an Excel program, but an Excel file can typically be opened in your statistical dedicated programs. And then there's what we refer to as delimited files. Now, delimited files at one point were simply the most preferred way of aggregating and disseminating data. And there's a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons is actually due to file size. And if we were to look, for example, at a data set, and this data set is related to the example that we will be looking at, if we were to look, for example, at the last file here, which is identified as a text file, which our delimited files will always be essentially a text file. Now you may see different endings. For example, a CSV is designated as a comma separated values or a comma delimited file, and we can that can be illustrated further. But basically, every delimited file is simply a text file. So this particular data set was downloaded and was a 2 megabyte data set. This is a data set that has roughly 2,500 cases with approximately 400 or so columns of information. So a fairly large data set. The file immediately above that is a SAS formatted data file. But we can see with the file size is significantly larger than the plain text format. And then the one above it with the XLS ending, this is the same data that was originally in that delimited format in that text file and was imported into Excel and then saved as an Excel file. So the exact same data, but the file size has increased from the original 2 megabytes up to 20 megabytes. So just simply importing and saving as an Excel file increased the file size by tenfold. And then finally we have the SAV format, which is the SPSS format. Now notice in this situation the file size is not really an issue. In fact, it's slightly smaller than what appeared in our original text file. But again, with the SPSS version and also the SAS version, we're getting into that program specific format, and therefore it may not transfer or allow someone else to easily open and access the data in order to work with it. So we can see with the delimited file, because it is just simply a plain text file and as a result does not incorporate all of the additional formatting that shows up in the Excel files, it's much smaller. And what that does then is allows for that file to be transferred much more easily. Now, I mentioned that this was a much bigger issue years ago when internet speeds were not at the point they were, when high-speed internet was not commonplace. And so to transfer a 2 megabyte file, for example, a floppy disk could only hold 1.4 megabytes. So technically that 2 megabyte data file would not have fit on a floppy disk, which was at one time the standard for saving and storing data. And so you can kind of get a sense of the fact that when delimited files were commonplace and preferred, space was a significant factor. Again, that's the space issue has somewhat been negated, but what has not been negated in terms of the attractiveness of delimited files is the fact that they're essentially a universal format, meaning virtually any program will be able to open and read a delimited file. You can take a delimited file and open it in Excel. You can take a delimited file and open it in SPSS or SAS or any other program. So it's somewhat that the universal donor, so to speak. Now, exactly what is a delimited file? We've already seen that a delimited file basically is a text file. If we were to open a delimited file, it would simply look much like an unformatted Word document. This particular file, again, is the same file that we will look at in later illustrations. And this particular file is what's referred to as a comma delimited file. And basically what will happen is when we transfer this file into Excel, the commas will actually tell the Excel file or the Excel program when to move to the next column in order to place the information. So for example, we have at the top, we have a lot of wording. What we will see when this particular file gets imported, all of the information all of these wordings will essentially become our column headings, because these correspond to the questions that were asked on our survey or whatever data collection instrument we were using. Now, beginning with the next row where we have all the yeses, nos, we have poor, fair, we have some more yeses, nos, and then we have some information out here at the end. This essentially becomes the responses for the first individual. And then the next row would be the responses for our second individual, and so on. So basically each row, and if we were able to expand this wide enough so that we didn't get the returns, essentially each row would represent a new patient. Now, what Excel will do is it will take, for example, this first row right here, and it will read across the row, and every time it encounters a comma, it will know to put the next set of characters into the next column of the spreadsheet. So what will happen is when this data gets imported, yes will show up in the first column, no will show up in the second, yes will be in the third, and then we'll move to the fourth with a no, the fifth column with a no, and so on. Now, again, this particular file is referred to, or format is referred to as a comma delimited format. Now, as far as what characters can be used as delimiters, we've already seen a comma. The other common formats are space delimited and tab delimited. Now, whether you choose a comma, space, or tab as the delimiter really is somewhat preference, but there are some issues or some instances where you want to be a little bit careful, and this depends on how your individuals are going to respond. For example, if we're delivering a survey and we're going to use something like SurveyMonkey, if we have an open-ended question, even if it's just a very short open-ended question, we might have something like list the 5 most common work-related injuries that you have experienced. And if we ask that type of question, then the respondent in most cases will simply list the first one, comma, second one, comma, and so forth. Well, because, or if we used a comma as the delimiter, then instead of putting that entire response as in one column, it will actually begin to try to separate each response and put it into a new column. Now, that wouldn't inherently be bad, except when the next individual just simply lists out 5 things without using commas, then all of a sudden their string of data ends up getting off. And so it will end up creating problems with the import process because the data and the fields will no longer line up. So in a situation like that, a tab would probably be the more appropriate choice, because again, if it's an open-ended response, in all likelihood it's going to include a space as well, because they'll have multiple words, so you're going to have a space between words. And so we have to be very careful and be aware of what type of responses that we're asking for to help decide which type of delimiter that we want to use. Now, in some cases, while these are certainly the most common ones, we might have a situation where, they could put a comma, they're definitely going to have spaces, they might even have a tab for some reason. In some cases, when you actually have collected data and you're ready to export the data, it's possible to actually specify the character that will be used as a delimiter, because again, the program that is exporting the data will insert that delimiter wherever, when it's appropriate. And so you might look and think, well, I know nobody's going to use a pound sign, and so you might say, okay, I'm going to specify the delimiter to be a pound sign or hashtag. And so in that file that we saw earlier, every place there's a comma, you would see a hashtag. And so what will then happen when you go to import your data, at some point in the import process, you would be prompted to identify what character is used as the delimiter. And of course, there's usually just check options for comma, space, tab, but then if none of those are appropriate, there's usually something like an other, and you can actually specify what character. So again, while these are certainly the most common ones that you would encounter, it's also possible if you are the one collecting stuff to specify a completely random character, a percent symbol, a dollar sign, an asterisk, something that a respondent would not have included anywhere in their survey response. So this gives you a good overview of what is meant by data management, and a quick look at the two most common ways of importing data into or getting data into our program, either be it manually having to enter data, or obtaining a data that's already in electronic format and then having to import it into our software.